A young boy, lost and alone in the desert,
This is some harsh, unforgiving terrain.
sends a distress call that authorities can't trace.
This is going to be a life-threatening situation.
What on earth did that poor kid go through?
A massive storm shows up on a radar,
It gives a weird signature.
but the skies remain clear.
You'd expect to see something. What other things might be up in the air?
Strange seismic signals in Oklahoma,
It's almost like a heartbeat. Boom, boom, boom.
but no source can be found.
That raises our attention level.
We have to have massive amounts of energy that can create these waves.
Signals to real events
Things going on thousands of feet below the surface.
that leave many questions unanswered.
Cover it up, deny it, or pretend it didn't happen.
There's something weird happening here.
Endless streams of data, information bombarding the planet from within and from the furthest stretches of the universe. What messages do these phantom signals hold? Tuesday, August 7th, 1973.
Hello?
Mrs. Darlene Ross, a California radio operator, hears a call for help over her CB radio.
A child was heard on the CB saying that his father had a heart attack and their pickup truck turned over, and all he had access to was the CB, so he was calling for help.
Mrs. Ross talks to the boy, hoping to piece together enough facts to find him. But she learns only that his name is Larry. He's 7 years old, and he's somewhere in New Mexico.
He couldn't give specific information about where he was, didn't really know his own last name, didn't really know where they were going, and so there was nothing for the people who heard the call to use to help find him.
With few clues to go on, Mrs. Ross calls the police in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Throughout the night and into the next day, search teams fly across the state trying to find the overturned truck.
In a search and rescue for a normal person, they might send out so many people. When it's a 7 or 8-year-old, they're sending everybody. Could cost millions to find the person. They don't care because they know if they had a limited amount of time to hone in on whatever signal was coming. Because how long would that truck battery last?
If the truck is turned over, it's likely not running. If the truck's not running, the engine's not powering that battery. That means Larry is on a timer. He's got to get help before that battery stops effectively keeping that radio running.
As the hours pass, reports come in that people from California to Mississippi have been talking to Larry on the CB radio.
CB radio is not very different from your cell phone. It's just an older, simpler technology.
It's 1970s. A lot of people were on CB radios. This one in particular has been in production for about 50 years or so. You have to cycle through the channels of operation, calling for anyone to give you help.
The main role of people talking to him on the CB is to keep him calm, keep him from panicking.
Fear really affects your response to the overall situation.
For a little boy to be alone in terrain like this, it would be absolutely terrifying. You don't know how to get help, and it can be deadly out here.
It's a hostile desert at night. The temperatures drop. At daytime, you could boil a tea bag in your boot. It's so damn hot. What on earth did that poor kid go through? I can't even imagine it.
It's been 24 hours and searchers have found no trace of Larry. But the CB operators talking to him are starting to pick up clues to his location. Larry's comments about the weather and the position of the sun lead them to believe he's in the Manzano Mountains near Albuquerque. The Army sends aircraft to the area, and when Larry says he sees flashing lights overhead, the search area is narrowed.
The Manzano Mountains are an old fault block, so it's essentially a giant cliff lifted up with some pieces cut out of it over time.
The area is 35,000 acres that is known for very dramatic mountain vistas. I mean, you've got hills, valleys, and straight up mountain peaks that have rocky crags exposed on the surface. So this is some harsh, forbidding, and unforgiving terrain. Trying to pinpoint an object as small as a vehicle, you could be out there forever.
Some mountainous areas can be a dead zone for radio signals.
Radio signals can be blocked if you're sort of in a crevice or in a ravine or something, and you're closed in on all sides, then the signal has literally nowhere to go.
I personally have been on many expeditions where we couldn't even use radios because of the terrain we were in. You could be within a couple hundred feet of another person, and you may not be able to get their signal.
But CB users report hearing Larry hundreds of miles beyond the Manzano Mountains. How is the signal getting out?
All mountains are bad for radio, but if you're going to have a mountain range, this is a pretty good one to be able to have some chance of a signal getting through. It's mostly sedimentary and metamorphic rocks. There's not a lot of metal, which is good because areas that have a high metal content, that have lots of ore, that have a lot of metal in the rocks, block and attenuate the signal much more rapidly. If you've ever noticed your cell phone reception cutting out inside of a skyscraper, it's because it has a metal frame building reinforcing all that concrete.
But the frequency range of CB radio gives it an advantage over cell phones.
The higher the frequency you go, the easier it is to block a signal. So cell phones usually operate at like 2.5 gigahertz. CB radio operates at a very low 30 megahertz, 25 megahertz. And so that's easier for them to propagate. So unless this person is in a very, very deep crevice, you should be able to get something out.
The hunt for Larry is in its second day. Search and rescue pilots continue to monitor their own radios, trying to hone in on Larry's CB signal.
That pilot would be really set up to pick up Larry's signal. As the plane comes up over the horizon, which already is at a high level, that signal coming off of the CB antenna will hit the plane. You can't triangulate a signal. That allows them to potentially find where Larry's at. So this is kind of a lower tech version of what you can use for homing in on a signal. So I'm using a highly directional antenna to point in a vicinity and figure out where the transmitting station is coming from. So the nice thing with using a directional antenna like this is it kind of works like a flashlight. So as I turn to face the beacon, I get a signal. Facing the opposite direction, no signal. Swing closer, and there it is.
But as searchers try to triangulate Larry's signal, the boy frequently changes the CB channel, hampering their efforts.
It's best to flip the little switch for channel 9, and that's what you use for emergency calls. When this story first came to light, there would have been a lot of activity on CB. There could have been a lot of people talking at the same time, and he may have heard people talking on a channel, tried to key up and talk. They didn't come back to him, so he probably switched to another channel and tried again.
So that makes it very, very hard for a search and rescue because to pinpoint a signal, you want a stable signal. If he was jumping channels, it would just constantly be cutting in and out.
The fact that Larry's 7, in distress, scared, they could have just been panic calling, I don't hear anybody, immediately I've got to flip channel. And they just kept doing that until maybe the battery was depleted.
Rescue teams are desperate to find Larry before his CB radio loses power. But efforts to get him to stay on one channel aren't working, causing suspicions for some.
He hits upon the worst possible solution. If you were trying to hide your signal, you would do exactly what this kid is supposed to be doing, because then you're not giving anybody a chance to lock onto your signal.
By the end of day 2, Larry's channel jumping, as well as inconsistencies in CB users' reports, raised questions about the authenticity of the story.
As the situation evolved, they're getting different data. At one point, the boy's name was Larry, and then at some other time, his name was David, and they're beginning to ask the question, could this be a hoax?
When that call first comes in and he doesn't know his last name or where he's from or where they're going, Larry should know these simple facts. He's supposed to be 7 years old. So either it's a hoax and they're trying to get a lot of people to waste a lot of time looking for somebody and a car that doesn't exist, or Larry's in shock. And what happens when you're in shock is that you don't think clearly. It becomes hard to remember things. Traumatic events can actually cause both retrograde and anterograde amnesia, forgetting for the time right before the trauma to a little bit of time after the trauma. So maybe in these initial calls, he's still in a period where in shock, he can't remember simple facts. Frankly, it could be something as simple as a concussion. And hopefully those memories will come back as time goes on.
Is a little boy lost in the desert, or is this an elaborate hoax?
You have to treat it seriously.
Search and rescue teams are at a loss.
The countdown to find Larry is desperate. He's running out of time.
In August of 1973, CB users from across North America pick up a distress call from a young boy called Larry, who claims to be lost in the New Mexico desert in a crashed truck with his unconscious father.
the father has some kind of a medical emergency and ditches the truck, possibly rolls it over.
Depending upon who you read and talk to, there was a question that his father was fatally injured.
His starting call pretty much gave them no information. But this did lead to a manhunt where they thought he was. Nobody could find him, and yet he continued to be able to talk on the CB and different people heard him.
But after 48 hours, searchers are no closer to finding Larry and his injured father. With so many people hearing Larry on the radio, why is no one able to find him?
You got CBs everywhere, you got somebody out there potentially needing help, and CB radio operators got involved.
CB users in Wyoming, Arizona, and even Canada have spoken to the boy. But Larry claims to be in New Mexico. How is it possible that his transmissions are being heard at such a distance?
Larry's likely using an AM modulating CB radio. That would limit him 5-10 miles with the chance of getting much further, but now you're talking about the skip propagation using the ionosphere.
Larry's signal was carried much further because of a radio frequency phenomenon known as skip shooting.
There's this layer on the atmosphere called the ionosphere, and it's full of ions, which are basically free charged particles. Normally a signal would just go through and it would just disappear and you would not be able to see it. But at certain frequencies, given a certain amount of ions, the signal sort of goes through and it gets curved back down to the earth.
With skip shooting, you're basically bouncing between layers of the atmosphere, or actually bouncing against the atmosphere, down to Earth, bouncing again, going back up to the atmosphere and bouncing down again. You've now kind of bent your signal around the curvature of the Earth.
And so you get this huge propagation distance without losing much power. There's no reason why it could not travel 1,500 miles.
The ability to skip shoot effectively is partly dependent on the solar cycle.
The solar cycle is an 11-year period where the high point is where there's lots of sunspots. So sunspots on the sun mean the sun is emitting more UV light. That UV light hits our atmosphere and creates ionization. More ionization in the atmosphere is good for skip shooting.
The distance a signal can travel depends on the point in the cycle.
Right now we are in a low solar cycle, and I can consistently talk to Japan, Korea, China, from my home location here in Southern California. At a high solar cycle, there are instances that have happened in the past where you can hear yourself after you talk, meaning your signal goes all the way around the Earth, comes back, and you hear yourself with a delay in time.
At the highest point of the cycle, Larry's transmission range could expand from 5 or 10 miles to as much as 24,000 miles under ideal conditions. 1973 is only at medium point in the solar cycle. However, Larry is transmitting during the summer, which has more sunspot activity than other seasons.
At the daytime, at least, that particular frequency space that CB is on would have been able to propagate further than any other time of the year. So it is entirely possible that Larry could have been picked up all the way up into Canada.
While people across North America are talking to Larry, the search back in New Mexico has been going on for days with no results. Temperatures have been in the mid-90s, and with no food and water, the odds are stacked against him.
You have to overcome the fear and sit down and start thinking logically, what am I going to do for water to be able to drink? What am I going to do for food? What am I going to do for shelter? You have no access to anything. There's no water, there's no food, and you're potentially injured. The time that you're able to live is measured in days. You know, most people without water after 3 or 4 days, this is going to be a life-threatening situation.
While efforts are in full force to find the lost boy, investigators begin to speculate on the authenticity of the story.
Part of the problem with the story is it's mentioned that Larry's father's truck flips over. CB radios generally use vertical antennas. A vertical antenna doesn't do well in an overturned truck situation. Further, if that radiating element, the whip as we call it, that's sticking up, is touching the ground, you're not going to get much effectivity out of the radio at all.
With days dwindling away, every hour spent transmitting is leaching the battery a little further.
So what I have here is just a simple setup. We've got a 12-volt battery, like one you can use from a car, and we have this voltage display. And basically it's showing the battery at 13.24 volts, so a fully charged battery. What I'll do is turn the radio on. So we've got a current draw of 0.27 amps. This is just on receive. If I key down and transmit, we should see this number come up. I'm looking for a radio check on channel 27. Radio check channel 27, anyone monitoring? And it comes up to 0.88789 amps. So almost a full amp on transmit. So we went from a 13.24 volts into a 13.16 volts on the battery. So we can do the math and figure out he would get roughly 6 to 8 hours on a full charged battery. If you're talking about batteries from the 70s and 80s, their quality is going to be less and you're going to get less charge life out of it. One would think you could just turn the car on and just start the battery charging again. The problem is that the truck had flipped over. So that's likely that the engine wouldn't be running. But let's say he had the wherewithal to actually turn the engine on. You still have a limited resource in the gasoline that can become electricity, which can charge the battery, which you then can deplete with your radio. Given the nature of the story, it's unlikely that he was transmitting more than a day.
With nobody reporting Larry missing and the number of discrepancies in CB users' reports, officials are close to ruling the whole thing a hoax. Larry's ordeal is making news across the world, raising the possibility of copycats.
Because there's a lot of publicity about hearing Larry, you might get some of these attention-seeking individuals.
Radio at that time is generally pretty anonymous. Anyone could have heard about a story of a lost boy and said, well, I'm just going to do that from California. I'm just going to do that from Canada. So it's entirely possible that multiple people were pretending to be Larry.
On day 5, a report of a missing Missouri family with a son named Larry renews fervor to the search, until the family is found a day later. Then on day 6, an Army sergeant claims to speak with Larry for a full 3 hours. But is it really Larry or a copycat? When a transmission on the 7th day is traced to a walkie-talkie in Phoenix, police have had enough. They call off the search.
So the question is, was Larry real? Was it a hoax?
I feel that generally this story is on the realm of a hoax. Larry was hopping around having conversations with people. His receiving ability wasn't hampered in any way. That means Larry has a functioning antenna at an appropriate elevation that he can get good signals in, which all leads me to believe he's not in a wrecked truck.
There are a few things that make me doubt this story. We never found Larry's truck or evidence of him and his father.
All signs point to that if they were driving in on a paved road, that somebody would have come across the wreckage. I think that the odds that this would never have been found in the last 40, 50 years, it just seems so small to me, to almost border on impossible.
There's tons of cases that have been left open-ended. They have never found the body. There's also cases where they finally found the ruins of an aircraft or a car decades later. So that's going to be the big question for a long, long time.
December 10th, 2018. Meteorologists track a massive storm that appears out of nowhere and is quickly heading towards Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky.
I can imagine the weather radar operators freaking out, wondering they're seeing some massive tornado or something like that.
Just over a week earlier, on December 1st, central Illinois is hit by 29 rare December tornadoes. Everyone is on high alert. The storm is expected to hit any minute. But as the hours pass, the skies remain completely clear. However, the storm image remains on the radar screen.
You'd at least expect to see something that the radar is reflecting off of. So you'd expect to see clouds, you'd expect to see rain, you'd expect something to be there.
Weather phenomenon that big can't suddenly appear on top of Illinois without having come from Canada or have come from the west or something like that. It has to come from somewhere.
How does a storm this mighty just vanish? Coming up, was the phantom radar image simply wrong?
Radar is full of strange signals.
Or is it a sign that something much more ominous is on its way?
When you see it, you're suddenly going, wow, what is it?
Weather stations catch a rogue storm rolling across the Midwest, but the skies are completely clear.
We're picking something up. You'd expect something to be there.
Did meteorologists simply get it wrong? Modern meteorology makes use of technology to help make accurate predictions, and at the core of the system is radar. But how precise is it?
A weather radar works in the same way that any radar does. It transmits a signal, it hits things that are in the atmosphere, water droplets, snow, ice, and comes back.
What you're trying to do is get a picture of what's happening in the atmosphere. One of the things, first of all, is how reflective what you're hitting off of is coming back. So if you have a really reflective thing, for example, melting ice, that could be really reflective and you get sort of a strong return back from that.
Advanced weather radar can not only detect rain, snow, and ice in the air, it can tell how quickly it is moving towards a location, like a city or town. This is the result of a scientific phenomenon known as the Doppler effect, which is the difference in how sound and light behave when it gets closer to its target.
We've all experienced the Doppler phenomenon. It happens with sound as well. If you've ever stood at the side of a train tracks and you hear a train coming in and you can hear there's a change in the tone as it comes towards you and then it goes away from you. That's a Doppler phenomenon because the frequency of the sound is changing as something is moving. Exactly the same phenomenon happens for a radio signal.
10 hours after the image is first spotted on radar, no storm has arrived in Illinois, Indiana, or Kentucky. Could it be something else entirely? Something even more dangerous?
If we have something in the air that's leading to that kind of reflections, you'd want to investigate it to make sure whatever is suspended in the air isn't harmful to people.
Doppler radar doesn't just pick up raindrops and ice. It can pick up other things blowing through the atmosphere.
There's a lot of different things that radar can reflect off. It could be debris generated by a factory or by some process that's unusually been emitted to the atmosphere.
Insects and other flying creatures can also show up on radar.
Birds have regularly in migration been seen on radar, and some birds will fly in patterns that can give an image of a storm-like radar reflection. And certainly in the past, there's been migrations of insects, of grasshoppers and other large insects that can produce radar reflections that look like a storm or look like a cloud moving across the radar.
A couple years back, we had a butterfly bloom here in Colorado, and the weather radar was lighting up with butterflies. When you see some of these signatures, it's not like you're suddenly like, oh, yes, well, it must be all those butterflies. It's sort of a lot of putting together a couple of things to see what's happening.
When you saw a large radar reflection like this that wasn't associated with a storm, that might be one of the first things you investigate is, hey, do we have any large outbreaks of locusts or something in the area?
There have been major outbreaks of locusts in Africa. If there are large numbers, they're all getting the same message. This is crowded here. We should move on. And then, of course, if they all move and if they're carried by a wind, then they're all going to be carried in the same direction. Then, therefore, if you have a radar, all of a sudden you see this massive cloud moving by. I think some of the largest ones have been 50, 100 miles wide. I mean, when there are millions and millions. And when you see it, you're suddenly going, wow, what is it?
But how can meteorologists tell the difference between weather and bugs?
In order to diagnose some of these strange things that you see in radar, it helps to look at the variety of fields that radar gives you. All of our National Weather Service radars in the U.S. are dual pole.
Dual pole stands for dual polarization radar, a series of pulses that are sent out and received back both vertically and horizontally.
And that gives you a lot more information about what type of scatterer that you're looking at. When you could really distinguish between things that we call meteorological, like raindrops, hail, snow, and things that are man-made, like debris and tornadoes or something like that. When I look at the radar data from Kentucky, it doesn't really scream a weather signal to me.
Coming up, is an insect invasion plaguing the Midwest? Or could there be some man-made explanation for this confusing radar signature?
The idea that some military organization or some scientist was performing an experiment isn't beyond the possibility.
A strange radar signal has weather experts in the Midwest rattled. It looks like a storm at first, but the skies remain clear even though the mysterious image remains on their screens.
There's definitely something there that the radar is bouncing off. We're picking something up that may not be obviously visible to somebody at ground level.
But if it's not a storm, then what is it? Why does the image persist? It turns out that weather radar can easily pick up swarms of birds, bats, and insects. Could this radar image be showing a giant swarm of bugs making its way across the Midwest?
In North America, the migratory insects go to the north in the summer and then to the south in the fall. So if you're seeing this thing on the radar in November or December, the likelihood of it being insects would be very small.
Some experts suggest this mysterious cloud is not a natural phenomenon.
It is possible that if there were a lot of competing signals or some stray signals, that could interfere with the radar. If it was in the same frequency range, it could make the equipment misinterpret something.
You get a lot of things back with weather radar. It's picking up all sorts of things, and sometimes cell phone towers, some of them are switching to closer to some of the radar frequencies. You get interference from those.
But that would be very unusual because we specifically avoid using those frequencies because radar is intended to be very sensitive and we don't want to disrupt them. So that would be really, really unusual.
Conspiracy theories point to covert military operations.
The idea that some military organization or some scientist was performing an experiment with radio waves that would interfere with radar isn't beyond the possibility. We do the same thing in the military now for disrupting the ability to detect aircraft, etc. But it would be very difficult to produce a radio wave pattern that would mimic a broad area that looked like a storm.
The size and shape of the image doesn't fit any of the possibilities raised by investigators. If it's not a storm or bugs or covert military radio waves, then what is it?
If I was trying to mimic a storm, I would probably release something into the atmosphere that would start reflecting the radar waves.
We actually did this project doing cloud seeding. So basically we had our radars out there looking at aircraft dropping cloud seeding particulates. And when you look at that, you see very clearly these sort of linear drops of the aircraft along the aircraft path. So you see what looks very similar to what they saw on the radar in Kentucky. That makes me pretty confident that what they're looking at is something being dropped from an aircraft, and most likely it's probably chaff.
In World War II, radar plays a really instrumental role in helping the Allies achieve victory. When war breaks out in 1939, both Germany and Britain have systems in place. It is an attempt by both sides to develop systems that can foil the enemy's radar. They come up with the idea of dropping chaff. And what chaff is it's basically pieces of paper that have aluminum on them, which are specially designed to be released from an aircraft as they go over their target. And the British discovered that this is a remarkable tactic.
Acting as a visual smokescreen, a real target lip becomes indistinguishable from the jamming on the radar display.
From an enemy's radar perspective, it makes it look like a large congregation of planes is in this area when it's not. It confused radar and allowed bombers to circumvent anti-aircraft devices.
Turns out it's not so easy to tell the difference between a storm and chaff.
Chaff is intended to kind of sit in the wake of the aircraft and suspend in the air a little bit. Once it starts moving with the air currents where it's been dropped, it will very much take on the radar appearance of a cloud.
A way to confirm whether or not it is or isn't chaff is looking at some other radar variables. You could look at the power that you get back from different polarizations. If it's not a thunderstorm or rain or something like that, you'd see very specific dual pulse signatures. So if you look at other images of chaff, you sort of see these very elongated, higher reflectivity or higher power return that's sort of indicative that it's being dropped out of an airplane and then sort of propagating with the airspeed. And then if you look down here, this would be more typical of a rain or a storm type pattern. As opposed to the chaff signature, it's not really that elongated feature. You kind of see a little bit more shape to it, and you also see that there's regions of higher reflectivity and lower reflectivity.
The elongated shape of the chaff cloud looks much like the radar image seen in Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky. A few days after the cloud is spotted, the West Virginia Air National Guard confirms that a C-130H Hercules jettisoning a large amount of chaff at a lower than usual altitude is responsible for the mysterious incident. The plane received permission to release the chaff, but why?
It's quite conceivable that it's an experiment designed to test how much they can actually control, radar systems or weather systems or monitoring systems.
It could be a military advantage to have a technology like this. If you wanted to mask the approach of a bunch of aircraft towards ground, you could have many aircraft put chaff out at the same time, and then any ground-based radar wouldn't be able to detect a fleet of aircraft in the air. It just looked like a storm.
Something strange is happening in the state of Oklahoma.
Seismic stations picked up a signal on June 24th, 2019 at 11:11 in the morning.
The anomaly was a series of pulsed seismic waves about 20 seconds apart that lasted for about 10 minutes and spread across the entire state of Oklahoma.
And at first, people thought, well, was it an earthquake?
Locals are used to looking out for atmospheric phenomena like tornadoes. Seismic events like earthquakes are less common.
Oklahoma can have earthquakes. They're usually pretty small, nothing like what we get in the Pacific Northwest or the southwestern U.S. It's just that it's very infrequent and typically is going to be something that people in the area are affected by. Now, this new signal doesn't dovetail with that at all. It's something very different. It affected people in the area pretty much not at all, but instruments picked up the signal.
To the seismologist's surprise, this isn't the last they see of the anomaly.
It wasn't picked up on just one station one time. Up to 52 different stations across the state were picking up this event, and it kept happening.
Seismologists searched back through the data and discovered that this strange signal has been happening regularly over the past 3 months.
Now, when you start to see more than one of an event like this, you wonder, is there a pattern? Is Oklahoma suddenly increasing seismic activity because of a new fault?
Coming up is a major earthquake about to hit Oklahoma.
This is not a natural-looking earthquake.
Or does science point to an even bigger threat?
We have to have massive amounts of energy that can create these waves.
Mysterious seismic waves are shaking up Oklahoma. For the past 3 months, a series of regular seismic anomalies has bewildered geologists and left residents preparing for the worst.
52 different stations were picking up this event, and it kept happening.
Is Oklahoma suddenly increasing seismic activity because of a new fault?
The nearest major fault line is the new Madrid Fault seismic zone, running through neighboring Arkansas and Missouri. At 125 miles long and 45 miles wide, it can be damaging and deadly.
So back in the early 1800s, the New Madrid seismic zone had a massive rupture.
We're talking 7 or 8 magnitude Richter scale. Now, the Richter scale didn't exist back then, so we're using eyewitnesses' accounts and the amount of damage that was done to estimate what that magnitude would be today.
Could the New Madrid seismic zone be at fault for the shaking in Oklahoma?
When it ruptured really big back in the early 1800s, they actually felt those ground waves as far away as Canada, on the eastern seaboard of the US, and also further down south into the Gulf region. That's what we would expect from a major rupture on the New Madrid seismic zone.
The thing about the signals that are being picked up in Oklahoma, they're just in Oklahoma.
The types of seismic waves being picked up cast doubt on this being an earthquake at all.
When you have an earthquake, the waves travel through the ground of the earth. We call this the body wave.
The body wave of an earthquake is actually 2 waves. A P, or pressure wave, pushes and pulls the rock it travels through. The P wave is followed by the S, or shear wave, that moves rock particles up and down.
And then when they hit the surface between ground and air, it creates surface waves.
Surface waves are the final blow. They travel through the Earth's crust and cause all the devastation we experience in an earthquake.
Those move the surface of the Earth, either up and down like a roller coaster or side to side like a sidewinder snake. Now, the signal that we're picking up here in Oklahoma is only surface waves. So this signal is not being transmitted through the Earth's core at all.
Seismographs have been picking up these waves for 3 months, but their pattern is proving difficult to understand.
These are very different than an earthquake where you have a discrete moment where the fault ruptures and the energy is released and then it tapers down gradually. These don't have that unique signature of wide at the beginning and then tapering at the end. This looks like more like a series of pulses.
It's really cool because you can see that there's this repeating pattern. Down here, these are different seismometers located throughout the state, and sometimes they pick it up, sometimes they don't. What's beautiful about it is how exact it is.
That regular reoccurring interval of the 20-second pulse happened on this very human schedule of daytime, weekdays, plus Saturday, and never on Sunday and never overnight.
So if I was looking at the data and I saw it was very discretely timed events, and it was regularly happening at the same intervals and happening over and over again, I'd be starting to look at non-natural phenomena. What can cause the ground to shake? Do I have somebody blasting somewhere? Do I have, some type of atmospheric testing going on somewhere? Do I have a plant that's releasing something or doing something that's going to have a major impact either to the atmosphere or to the ground.
Anytime you're talking about Oklahoma and seismic signals, the first guess is always going to be fracking.
Energy is an important industry in Oklahoma, and fracking is one of the major ways that oil and gas are extracted.
In fracking, we're trying to get natural gas out of shale. Shale's a very dense rock that doesn't allow gas to flow through it. To improve the amount of flow of gas through the shale, we pump extremely high pressure water into the shale to fracture it and break it up. And then we put very fine particles in with that high pressure water that keep those cracks open once we form them. If we pump enough liquid into these wells, they can slide and move, and we get earthquakes associated with fracking.
Naturally occurring earthquakes and fracking-induced earthquakes produce the same seismic signal. The only way to tell the difference is from human clues.
With those, you often see a very big spike and then a tapering. With this, it's more like pulses.
What we're seeing here is not fracking.
Having ruled out both natural and fracking earthquakes as the cause, scientists start to look at other ideas.
Anytime we see a phenomena occurring that isn't what we expect, that raises our attention level. It could be something that is potentially dangerous. It could be no big deal. But until we know more about it, we don't know whether we need to inform the public to prepare to leave for a temporary evacuation or to relax. It's no big deal.
The shaking of Oklahoma is just, that's such a large scale. To have larger detectable events, we have to have massive amounts of energy put into the ground that can create these waves.
The most likely culprit would be explosions.
Major explosions can be picked up by seismometers.
The original global seismic network was actually set up in order to monitor for explosions. It was set up to monitor compliance with the nuclear test ban treaties and to look for secret weapon tests. Because of this, we spent a lot of time and effort understanding what the seismic signature of an explosion looks like. It looks like a sudden burst of energy that then tapers off.
The Sunrise propane explosion was one of the largest explosions to occur in Canadian history. It was picked up by seismic stations in the southern Ontario and northern US area. You can actually see a pressure wave traveling outward at the speed of sound, and that displaced roofs on houses and smashed windows and caused damage to more than 200 homes in the area.
But an accidental explosion isn't a reoccurring event. Could the military or a government organization performing secret weapon tests be causing this vibration?
Because of the number of underground bases that are literally all over the United States and even in other parts of the world, there may be things going on literally hundreds, if not thousands of feet below the surface that would create some sort of activity.
We remember, especially during the Cold War, the United States carrying out an enormous range of clandestine operations. And of course, American culture is littered with references to Area 51. The Americans have a dozen or so places which are so secretive that we assume there's always something really, secret going on. The harboring of aliens, new secret airplanes that are being built. The truth is that, yeah, those places exist. We built the U-2 spy plane in the middle of a secret base, right?
But other clues pointed in a different direction.
When we're looking at this, it has some of the characteristics of an explosion, but it's not exactly right. There's something else and weird happening here.
The Oklahoma pulse wasn't just a single event, but a whole sequence of explosions, one after another, after another, after another, after another. They're all the same magnitude and regularly spaced apart. That's not something you would usually do in a weapons test, and you certainly wouldn't do it 10 minutes at a time, day after day after day after day.
Coming up, seismologists think they found the source of the mysterious groundquakes, but the potential danger is still unknown.
We don't know whether we need to prepare for a temporary evacuation.
What's going on here? Why are we picking this up?
Throughout the spring and summer of 2019, seismometers in Oklahoma are picking up a strange vibration.
This is not a natural-looking earthquake.
The signal repeats every morning at 11 a.m., except on Sundays.
The timing of the signal told us it had to be created by humans. Nature doesn't follow business hours.
This pattern of signal carries on for several weeks. With little progress in finding out what it is, scientists turn their efforts to finding out where the signal is coming from.
One of the things that we can do with seismometers is we can triangulate where the source is.
With enough time and enough signals and enough stations, geophysicists were able to backtrack the exact pinpoint location of the source, the McAllister Army Ammunition Plant.
What they're doing at the ammunition factory is they're destroying old ordinances. And so they do it every day except on Sunday, which matches the pattern at 11 a.m. and at 20-second increments so that you don't get this rippling effect. I think that they were probably surprised that the seismometers across the state were picking it up.
But why would these small, controlled explosions be detected by seismometers across the state? One theory is that the seismometers are actually picking up sound waves.
Sound is what we perceive as vibrations in the air, but sound travels through all mediums. A good example is if you go put your ear on the railroad track and you can hear the train through the metal. Earthquakes are just really, really big, really, really low amplitude sound waves traveling through the ground. So really what a seismograph is, it's just a microphone that picks up really, really large scale sound.
But if these are sound waves, they're not taking a direct route to the seismometers.
This event was only surface waves, and traveling just through the surface created this unusual complication. Every time you had these surface earthquakes, it was vibrating the air, and the air would send out an acoustic wave, sound, which would then vibrate the ground and regenerate more of the signal at the same frequency because it's all getting driven the same way.
And so it's not hard to imagine an explosion being picked up even hundreds of miles away.
The work the seismologists are doing has bigger ramifications than just the Oklahoma waves. In the age of nuclear weapons, there are many detonations we can't explain. It's critical to determine the difference between what is natural and what humanity is responsible for.
We have some amazing arrays of sensors now that are finely tuned and are monitored 24/7. They're always recording information, which is always being analyzed by computers and humans to ensure that nothing falls through the cracks. So we are at a point with our understanding of seismology where we can actually really clearly figure out, most of the time, where things come from and what they likely are.
100 years ago, we didn't have all the equipment that we have today. And that's what science is. The science is, I have this phenomena, I don't know what it is. Let's research it and build a knowledge base around it. And then eventually we get to the point where we can detect these things and work towards a set of hypotheses that make sense and hopefully narrow it down at the end of the day to the single hypothesis that you can then conclude this is likely what happened.